Good morning, guys, and welcome to this new lesson. Today we are going to talk about two great pedagogists and compare them since their theories are somewhat in opposition to each other. In fact, we are going to talk about Piaget and Vygotskij. Already last time I had done a video on Piaget telling a little bit about his life, his studies, and his theory of the whole cognitive development of the child divided into various stages. So if you want to catch it up, you can find it here in the info. Now we will quickly look at Piaget and then move on to Vygotskij, precisely analyzing both his thinking and putting it in parallel with Piaget's. Regarding Piaget, I already explained to you last time that the cognitive development of the child is divided into various stages sequential to each other, and for Piaget this sequential development of these stages is not only important for thinking, but it is also important for language, because language, according to Piaget, develops as a consequence of thinking. That is, the child through, and we already saw this last time, these mechanisms of assimilation and accommodation will develop thinking and consequently will be able to develop language as well. So language is consequent to the development of thinking. The child for Piaget develops representational capacity in early childhood, and during the sensory-motor stage the child possesses very simple schemata that make him perceive the external world and respond reflexively to perceptual stimuli. From 18 months to 7 years, on the other hand, much more complex schemata are consolidated, which are somewhat of an evolution of the previous schemata, and will therefore allow the child to develop mental representations of perceived objects and consequently also the development of language. At this stage of his life, according to Piaget, language is purely egocentric, which means that practically the child has no cognition that beyond his own point of view there may be others. So he is not at all concerned with adapting his language to what may be the needs of the interlocutors with whom he comes to speak. In second childhood, on the other hand, which runs from ages 7 to 11, thinking still remains hooked on concreteness, but it becomes less self-centered. Piaget says that at this stage the child can hardly yet disengage from his own point of view and look at other points of view. However, language becomes more socialized. From the age of 12 and up, however, with the abstract logical stage, thinking will also become hypothetical, deductive and abstract, and language will be more evolved. Now, however, let us get to know Vygotskij and his point of view. Was born in Orsa, Belarus, 1896, and would die quite early, 1934, in Moscow. He was to be educated through university studies covering both philosophy and the humanities. He found himself working mainly during the Soviet regime, which frowned on relations with the West and Western thought precisely on the development of the child and man, because it centered all its thinking only on social development. Whereas Vygotskij, while adhering to this thought, never stopped confronting even what were Western ideas on child development. During his short life, numerous were the studies and publications he did on psychology and children and educational psychology, both with regard to children with mental and physical deficits. But his most important work dates precisely from 1934, the year of his death, and it is Thought and Language, a work that a couple of years after his death was condemned by the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party, because it was considered too much in favor of what were all Western theories on scientific psychopedagogy. In this very work, Thought and Language, Vygotskij decidedly distances himself from Piaget, in that the child who analyzed Piaget was a child who, discovering the world, was somewhat like a scientist isolated in his laboratory experimenting with the world around him. Vygotskij is very critical of this aspect, as in his view, instead, the aspect of the child's sociality is the most important one. In fact, for Vygotskij, the child grows in interaction with others, especially in an early period precisely with adults, and this interaction has a very positive effect on the child, because it helps him precisely in the development of his mental abilities. So the analysis that Vygotskij does is precisely of the child within its social context and divides the child's mental and cognitive development through stages such as did Piaget. Vygotskij became interested in language by defining it precisely as a fundamental psychic function for the child and one that develops through social interaction with others. It is basically an interpsychic function that continuously connects a child with the rest of the world and a person with other people. So for Vygotskij, the development of the child is important in that the child itself has an interaction with the environment and all people with the social aspect, so we need to analyze the social history of the child to understand its development. Through the external environment, the child learns to interact with others and internalize what are behaviors based precisely on communication. The author talks about social interaction with the environment from birth until the moment one dies. The child then, somehow for Vygotskij, learns almost first to speak and then to think. So if for Piaget the child first learns to think, and then after developing these early forms of thinking slowly with sequential states also begins to speak and thus learns language, for Vygotskij it is exactly the opposite. The child will first learn to speak and then to think. Meanwhile, these two functions for Vygotskij are independent of each other at least until the age of 2, and then they merge together. In all cases, however, the child will first begin to speak and then internalize this language in some way and slowly transform it into actual thoughts. So for Vygotskij, the interaction between adult and child from interpsychic and thus mind to mind becomes intrapsychic, that is, within the same mind, exactly like language, which is a fundamental tool of thought. As I told you before, for Vygotskij, language and thought initially are independent of each other, then they will merge and be the basis of each other, and they merge together around the age of 2. Which is when the child understands that every object has a name and you start using words as symbols. Around the age of 3, according to the author, interpersonal language is divided into 2 major categories. On the one hand, communicative language, which will remain precisely the language with others, and on the other hand, egocentric language, which will instead become the language with oneself. This egocentric language initially is what the child will use when speaking aloud to himself, and it will have a very important function for Vygotskij because it helps the child to guide thinking, to deal with problems, and to plan actions. And at 7 or 8 years old, this egocentric language will transform and become a little bit the inner language. So here again, there is a big difference between Piaget and Vygotskij, in that while for Piaget the egocentric language is a language that reflects the child's inability to look at the external point of view, and then slowly as the child grows up he will abandon it. For Vygotskij, the egocentric language is very important because it helps the child to plan actions, to solve his own problems, and it becomes his inner language. The last difference is that for Piaget, thought develops, as we have seen, independently of language, or rather, language is really a consequence of thought. Whereas for Vygotskij, language gives a very strong impetus to the construction of thoughts, and those thoughts that by themselves could not come into being, if not precisely because of internalized language. Another substantial difference between the two bulls is on the educational method, in that for Piaget one must follow what are the spontaneous aptitudes of the child and not impose accelerations on his development, while for Vygotskij there is an area of potential development that, if properly stimulated by the adult, will facilitate learning and foster learning that is difficult to achieve in other ways. So this area of potential development corresponds somewhat for the author to what are still the immature functions of the child, and which should be properly stimulated and helped to develop by the adult, to be absolutely distinguished from the area of actual development, which instead is that set of cognitive abilities that the child has developed up to that point. Human development for Vygotskij is configured as a social historical product, thus an adult helping to build a platform on which the child can climb and then add all his or her personal characteristics. According to Vygotskij, all social relationships are crucial for the child's development. That is, even if the child comes to be with, for example, an adult who does not have an active intention to necessarily teach the child something, this social interaction will still help the child develop skills and help him precisely in his development of mental activities. According to the author, another key point is to act preventively, that is, already in preschool age, to help the child develop these skills, because even before the institution through school can help the child develop his mental skills, the child is already predisposed to this. And so, for example, through play, which becomes the fundamental basis on which to build an educational plan as well, start from the very beginning to help him develop his abilities. With that, I finished my talk on Vygotskij and the differences between Vygotskij and Piaget. both from a language point of view and from an educational point of view. I hope I have been clear. If you have any questions, don't worry, write them down below as well, and I will see you in the next video. Best regards and thank you.